Hello and welcome to Noteworthy Reading, Episode 2 of our Tolkien series, entitled Oxford, Edith, and War. If you missed our first episode, that really covers Tolkien's childhood, adolescence, and high school years. This episode is going to cover his entry to Oxford, his engagement to Edith, and his training for World War I. We also have a YouTube channel, so if you've missed that, you definitely want to look for, just search Noteworthy Reading on YouTube, and you should see our channel come up. And if you're listening via podcast, maybe you don't know, we do have a video with visuals and graphics that sort of display what we're talking about. So be sure to catch that and don't miss that. Now, when we start talking about Tolkien, his entry to Oxford, I kind of want to back up a little bit because we have to address when he met Edith, who would later become his wife. He met Edith at the age of 16 in 1908, and they were both under the care of Father Francis Morgan, and Edith could play piano, she danced, she was very beautiful. She was 3 years older than Tolkien, so she was 19 and he was 16, so a little bit of an age gap, but Tolkien was head over heels in love. And unfortunately, as soon as Father Morgan found out about that, he quickly separated them and instructed Tolkien that, hey, you know, he had to wait till he was 21 before he could even correspond with her. So Tolkien receives that instruction from Father Morgan, and instead of being bitter, instead of, even losing connection to Edith, he maintained his affections for both people, for Father Morgan and Edith, and agreed to put the relationship on pause, get his education under his belt, and then move forward later. One note about Edith, her last name was Bratt, B-R-A-T-T, and I looked up because I wanted to know. I was thinking, was her name just as, disadvantageous today as it was back then? And yes, that word Bratt, B-R-A-T-T, actually comes from a English Midlands term that refers to a beggar's cloak. And there's also a Celtic Irish term, brat, that is connected to the idea of a cloak. And I guess that term ameliorated and became something that described a kind of misbehaving child, or, someone who wasn't disciplined as a brat. So in 21st century fashion, we could say that Edith probably wanted her name changed. And Tolkien lived up to that and did eventually change it, but we'll get to that later. First, I want to talk about Tolkien's entry to Oxford. In October of 1911, Tolkien entered Oxford by way of automobile. He was with another student by the name of L.K. Sands, who sadly, L.K. Sands would be killed by German machine gun fire 4 years later in World War I. Upon arrival, and in keeping with his generation, Tolkien enlisted in the King Edward's Horse Cavalry Regiment, okay? And his job in that regiment was to train horses. He would get a horse, and no sooner had he trained and broken that horse would he be given another horse to train and break, and the cycle repeated itself. So, we might think of his job as a little bit frustrating, but Tolkien had he had an affinity with horses. He doesn't just write about horses in his books from sort of a far-off place. Oh, they're very beautiful. Oh, look at them in the pasture. He scooped the poop. He trained them when they were ill-tempered and misbehaved. So he knew the bad side of a horse. He knew the beauty of a horse. He knew the potential that could be built into a horse, and that sort of symbiotic relationship that horses could have with people. And when we see Tolkien in his literature talk about Shadowfax, talk about Hasselhoff, he actually gives names to a lot of the horses that appear in the text. Bill the pony, there's a real connection that characters have to that horse. It's not just a, sort of a soulless animal. He really treats it as a beautiful being that is part of the team. So he does, and I guess I bring up the King Edward's horse just to show that, he wasn't doing this just out of like a kind of a fantastic idea about horses. He really had hands-on experience, probably the most difficult hands-on experience, and he still thought very highly of them and really included them in his literature. Real quick, let's talk a little bit more about Oxford. Now, Oxford had been around for 7 centuries. It was, obviously still is today, the premier center of learning. Probably one of the most difficult places to get accepted to. And Oxford was founded by Alfred the Great. Now, Alfred the Great was one of the first great Anglo-Saxon kings. He successfully defended England from the Vikings. England's boroughs and shire system, like the way that they organized their communities, actually comes from Alfred the Great. That was part of one of his he fortified those boroughs, fortified those shires, and sort of set them up so that they were not as easily invaded. Also, Alfred the Great was one of the first kings. He was the first English king to write a book. And actually, let me see. Was he the first English king? That's what I have here. He was the first English king to write a book. One of his books, called Doom Book, which was written in Old English. In Old English, that would be Dombach, comes from the word doom, meaning judgment, okay? And what it did was it integrated secular law with scripture with an emphasis on mercy, okay? Which is really an interesting format for laws back then. For instance, one of the stranger laws that you find in that book is that, if a man chops down a tree and it accidentally lands on some other man and kills that man's family would be entitled to all the lumber of that tree. Okay, the person who chopped it down, who obviously wasn't intending to kill anyone, involuntary manslaughter, he wasn't about to have to pay a murder sentence. So you find sort of these nuances of law. You find Christian compassion in law that Alexander the Great pioneered into the English system. That's one of the reasons why he's Alfred the Great. Now, within the Oxford College, Tolkien entered Exeter College. Exeter College was founded in 1314 by Walter Stapleton, who was a priest for students, and he mainly trained clergy. That was really why he founded that college. So, Tolkien enters Oxford. He's an orphan of little means, and so, maintaining his scholarship is going to be really important. But, was he the laser-focused first-year undergraduate that we hope he was? And did he thrive in his first year? In short, no. They say that Tolkien's mantelpiece was littered with invitations to all sorts of clubs, nearly all of which he joined. So in addition to King Edward's horse, he also was a member of all these clubs. He also started 2 clubs while he was at Oxford. Apoletics, which is the Aristotelian term for the morality based on the pursuit of pleasure, and then another club called the Checkers Club, where he would host fine dinners and they would give lectures on whatever topic they wanted to give lectures on. He also took to buying Japanese furniture with his very, small allowance from Father Francis Morgan, and fancy clothes. And so we get the idea that he's a little distracted in his first year. This is the first freedom he's really had, outside of the care of his guardian, and he's a little bit kind of having some fun out there and is not necessarily taking his studies extremely seriously. He was also not particularly into his major. He started out, we talked in the last episode, the last podcast, about how he started majoring in the classics. Well, he was really just majoring in the classics just so that he could, he would get through all of the Homer and Virgil that he would have to study with the classics, so that he could then justify studying all of the other sort of northern mythologies and languages that he wanted to study. So he was he hadn't really found out what he really wanted to do yet, and we know that while he's studying the classics, he is also checking out C.N.E. Eliot's A Finnish Grammar from the Exeter Library, and then he's using that to read the Finnish Kalevala. So he's teaching himself Finnish so that he can read mythology in Finnish. He also read a poem called Sinwolf, which is also known as Christ. It's an old Anglo-Saxon poem. I believe it's anonymous. We don't know who wrote it. But in that poem, he came across the term Middengard, or Midgard, which means the middle the middle yard where humans dwell in Old English. So we believe that he kind of got that concept or got that idea of Middle Earth from that poem. And also in the poem Sinwolf, we find these lines, which if you've ever read the Silmarillion, you'll kind of recognize. And these are in Old English. And my Old English pronunciation is not great at all. But it says, Elna Erendil Ingul Berotast, Ofer Midengard Munum Sended, which is Old English for Hail Erendil, brightest of angels, sent unto men upon Middle Earth. When we look at who this Erendil person is, Erendil actually in Old English is sort of a term that references the morning star. Okay, the morning star being Venus, which is a precursor to the sun. And when we look at the Old Testament in Luke 1:68 through 79, the rising sun is a reference to Christ. Okay, so the morning star, which is a precursor to the sun, is then thought to be a picture of John the Baptist. So in Sinwolf, we find Erendil, who is a picture of John the Baptist. And Erendil is the precursor to one of the characters in Tolkien's Silmarillion, who is mentioned in his poem, The Voyage of Erendil, the Evening Star, which is one of Tolkien's initial entries into the Silmarillion. So, we don't know exactly, if he intended to carry over all this information from Sinwolf into this poem, but it's kind of hard to deny. I mean, it seems like he's drawing pretty heavily from Sinwolf when he's coming up with some of the initial concepts for the Silmarillion. So Tolkien's supposed to be studying the classics, but he's a little bit distracted, as we talked about before, and he has a lot of friends. He has kind of a broad friend base, and then he has one close friend. His name was Colin Cullis. Unfortunately, Colin Cullis would die in a few years from the Spanish influenza. But what that meant was Tolkien had a very poor showing on his 1913 exam, which was over the classics. And actually, it wasn't a very poor showing. He got a second-class grade. All right, and this exam, just to tell you a little bit about it, it took place over the course of a week in 3-hour sessions, where he was supposed to write 12 essays, and in those essays, he was supposed to translate Virgil's Latin and Homer's Greek, and expound on the antiquities of the ancient Latins and ancient Greeks. And he doesn't do very well. Okay, and this puts his scholarship kind of in jeopardy. He sort of has to reorient and say, do I really want to major in the classics or not? And he makes a move to change his major, essentially. Instead of majoring in English with an emphasis in the classics, he decides to major in English with an emphasis in language. Okay, so he makes this change and is put under the headship of a scholar by the name of Kenneth Sazem, who later, he would actually, in 1925, he would contend with Kenneth for the Anglo-Saxon professorship. Kenneth Sazem was known to be kind of a severe man. He wasn't really a relaxed person. he was pretty hypercritical. And Tolkien was very opinionated and already, knowledgeable. He knew a lot about languages from an early age, and they butted heads a lot. But obviously, Tolkien learned a lot from the man, and also Kenneth was trained by a fellow by the name of Arthur Napier, and so, I just want to make sure we don't miss that. The scholar that taught Tolkien, the scholar that taught Tolkien was a Napier. So I have to say that. I can't leave that out. So Tolkien changes his major. Now he's studying the languages and mythology that he's always wanted to study without having to go through the classics, and he wins the English Prize for Excellence in 1914. Tolkien spent his prize money, £5, on a volume of literature by a fellow by the name of William Morris. William Morris was also Exeter alumni, and he was not only was he a writer, he was a visual artist. He painted, he designed tapestries, he designed furniture, and he was the author of 2 works, one called The Life and Death of Jason, and another, The House of the Wolfings. He wrote other things too, but those were the two works that inspired Tolkien. Tolkien bought those and devoured them and really, really loved them. And that is where we think he kind of got his quote-unquote high style of writing. We see things in Lord of the Rings, like when Gandalf says, so are all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. You know, like that way of speaking is not normal. You know, even for, you know, the British in the Victorian era, it was a little, it seemed archaic. It had this archaic feel to it. He got that high style from William Morris. And I remember talking to a young lady right after I read it when I was in high school. And she was talking about how Tolkien, she was like, I just don't get it. You know, it's poorly written. It sounds weird. You know, there's all this scenery and maps and stuff. And there's these poems, and it's just not that, she didn't understand it. And to an extent, I can see what she was saying. But that high style of writing goes back to that influence that William Morris had on Tolkien. And to say a little more about William Morris is something, he is known as a pre-Raphaelite, okay? The pre-Raphaelites were a group of artists in the Victorian era, and they believed art should be as similar to the real world as possible, okay? And they kind of were rebelling against Raphael. Raphael, the painter, he painted, you know, very lifelike people, but they were always kind of surrounded by this mystic, sort of magical, unlifelike, too good to be true surroundings, okay? And if you look at a painting in the pre-Raphaelite era, one painter who painted the painting, you can Google it. It's a painting called Ophelia, and it was painted by Sir John Everett in 1851. He was very dedicated to making it lifelike, okay? It took him 5 months to just paint the water, all right? So he's very intent on making it precisely look real. But the painting itself isn't idealized, okay? And the painting, if you look it up, it's of a young woman. She's laying in a stream, okay? She's in a Victorian dress, and she's just laying there, and she has sort of a look of longing in her eyes, you know? And it's actually really captures the pre-Raphaelites very well, because they were dedicated, they wanted to show the beauty of life, but they also wanted to show, you know, the algae in the water and the, you know, not always idyllic landscape. Another example would be, you know, if somebody is, you know, in their home and it's a pre-Raphaelite painting, they'll be in their home, but, you know, a drawer will be open and there'll be things on the desk and there'll be an unmade bed or something like that. You know, it's a more realistic sort of still life of the human experience, not sort of an idealized version of the Catholic faith or of you know, what people's lives were like back then. So if we want to look at some of the writing from the pre-Raphaelite era, aside from William Morris, look at someone by the name of Christina Rossetti. Okay, she wrote a poem called "Song." It was written in 1848 and published in 1862, and part of it goes like this. And it's a very, just when you listen to it, think of painting a picture of beauty, but sort of a brokenness. You know, beauty in a broken world. Okay, that's very apparent in this poem. She sat and sang alway by the green margin of a stream, watching the fishes leap and play beneath the glad sunbeam. I sat and wept alway beneath the moon's most shadowy beam, watching the blossoms of the May weep leaves into the stream. I wept for memory, she sang for hope, that is so fair. My tears were swallowed by the sea, her songs died in the air. In that picture, I don't know if this is Christina Rossetti's actual, you know, recollection of some experience she had, or if she was just sort of writing about a moment that she imagined. You see, you know, two beautiful young ladies, and they're kind of longing for more than what they have. They're maybe wishing that you know, life wasn't so short, or maybe they're wishing for things that they'll never have. All of those things are portrayed in that poem, and it is a very stark example of a pre-Raphaelite idea. Someone else you might look at who was writing at the time, it's G.K. Chesterton, who wrote a lot of works, The Everlasting Man, Orthodoxy. He was writing at the time, and one quote that we have from the preface of Orthodoxy also really captures this idea of beauty in a broken world and what that means to us. In his preface of Orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton writes, "Moments of pleasure are the remnants of paradise washed ashore from a shipwreck, bits of paradise extended through time. We must hold these relics lightly and use them with utility and restraint, never seize them as our entitlements." That's a very Christian sort of idea that the wonderful, beautiful things that we find in life are the remnants of a lost Eden. Okay, it's remnants of a broken paradise that we still see and we still find, but it's not, life's not perfect. So Tolkien reflects this in a lot of his poems. The elves, for example, in the Silmarillion and in Lord of the Rings, they're in Lothlorien, which Lothlorien is actually kind of a pre-Raphaelite picture. You have leaves that are always falling. You have these beautiful golden leaves in this golden wood where they inhabit the trees, and their homes are always built around this landscape, but the landscape is fading, the landscape is dying, and the elves, there's sort of the sadness that just looms over them, and they know that they're going to have to leave and go to the Grey Havens. And so you see a really clear picture of even just immortal people, who, if they're not killed or something befalls them, they live forever. But their land and the wood that they live in, the beautiful wood, is fading because it's a broken place. I would say that as human beings we experience that more so because we're not immortal. We're all kind of passing through this place. We're all in this together, and while we experience health and youth and moments of wonder and beauty, it doesn't last forever, and we quickly come to learn the things that we wish we could hold on to in life slowly slip through our fingers. That's a very pre-Raphaelite idea, and Tolkien was greatly influenced by William Morris and the pre-Raphaelites. When I first read that, I was like, is there anything to this? But I really do see it now, and I think it's a very big part of the picture, big part of why Tolkien did some of the things he did. And if you want to read more about that, you should definitely read The Fellowship, The Literary Lives of the Inklings by, it's actually by two people, Philip and Carol Zelinsky. It's a good read. The chapters on Tolkien are very, very good. So you should definitely check that out if you want to know more about the pre-Raphaelites. Also, I wanted to look, we're talking about how Tolkien's influences. I wanted to look at some of Tolkien's poetry before World War I. So we're going to look at one publication that he had in the Oxford Poetry. It was published in Oxford Poetry in 1915, and it's a poem called Goblin Feet. Okay, and just to tell you, I'm not really a big fan of it, and neither were his friends. When he showed this poem to Chris Wiseman went so far as to say, when you're finished creating this, it'll be as dead to you as the atoms that create our living food. And G.B. Smith wrote his girlfriend, his fiancée that he was engaged to at the time, and told her, I really don't think Tolkien's on his game here. And you might think of it this way, okay? Tolkien is a budding artist. He hasn't really found himself yet. He's trying to create an aesthetic. He's really has something deep inside of him that he wants to say, but he doesn't know how to say it. And I don't know if you've seen the movie The Man Who Invented Christmas, where Dan Stevens plays Charles Dickens. But there's this moment in that movie where he says, he's trying to think of what to call his villain, all right? And he says, he's like, his face is all, twisted and angst because he's just trying to think of who he's going to call his villain. And he says, it's Scratch, Scrunge, and then the music flares up and he looks right in the camera and he says, Scrooge. He got it. He found what he was trying to say. Tolkien is not there yet, okay? Tolkien, in his early poetry, he just hasn't found his aesthetic or his audience yet. But I'll read a little bit of Goblin's Feet to you so you can hear kind of what his style was like before, in his pre-World War I younger days. The last part of Goblin Feet goes like this. I'm off down the road where the fairy lanterns glowed, and the little pretty flitter mice are flying. A slender band of grey, it runs creepily away, and the hedges and the grasses are a-sighing. The air is full of wings and of blundery beetle things that warn you with their whirring and their humming. Oh, I hear the tiny horns of enchanted leprechauns, and the padded feet of many gnomes coming. Oh, the warm, oh, the hum, oh, the colors in the sky, oh, the gauzy wings of golden honey flies, oh, the music of their feet, of their dancing goblin feet, oh, the magic, oh, the sorrow when it dies. And those are the last lines. And I want to before we talk about it, I want to read one more poem. It's called The Cottage of Lost Play, and you can kind of hear a similar rhythm and pick up on a similar sentiment. The last lines of the Cottage of Lost Play go like this. And why it was tomorrow came, and with his grey hand led us back, and why we never found the same old cottage or the magic track that leads between a silver sea and those old shores and gardens fair, where all things are that ever were, we know not, you and me. Okay, so Tolkien's poetry, when he was younger, it really, it's this longing for an idyllic past, and he's trying to sort of paint a mythology, like, you have these almost... what is it? It's the flitter mice are flying. Like he's trying to find and create sort of a creatures to inhabit a mythological world, but it's just not, his world building is just not there yet, and it's just not very good. And his friends kind of understood that. But what you don't see in Tolkien is you don't see a very to compare him to somebody who is also writing at his time, James Matthew Barrie. James Matthew Barrie, who author of Peter Pan, he wrote a novel that became a play, and in Peter Pan, he's using like pirates, he's using Indians, he's using lost boys, and he has a very well-developed character of Tinkerbell. He's really got his world built, and he's carefully selected the ways he's going to build it. And Peter Pan, he's not longing for his lost past. He like embodies almost the spirit of the orphan, and it's he doesn't have any parents. He's just living for play, and he in fact when he's faced with death and the idea that life does pass you by, he just says, hey, death would just be another big adventure. So even his perspective on mortality is a lot different from Tolkien's. But I didn't want to not mention that Tolkien, after seeing the play in 1920, he wrote, it was indescribable, but I shall never forget it as long as I live. He really liked Peter Pan and was heavily influenced by it. So Tolkien is he's studying under Kenneth Sesam. He's doing a lot better in his studies. And in January 3rd, 1913, Father Francis Morgan's ban on he and Edith's relationship is lifted. Okay, and we don't know if it's to the hour or not, but Tolkien quickly wrote Edith and contacted her by a letter asking her to re-engage with him in their relationship, and he's trying to woo her back. Edith is actually engaged to one of her close friend's brothers at this time. She feels she's 3 years older than him, and so she kind of felt like she was on the shelf, like it's about time for her to get married. And Tolkien wins her back, okay? And they were married eventually in 1916, just before World War I, and they would go on their honeymoon, and she would go with him as he trained for World War I. Also around this time, around the time that he wrote her that letter and won her back, Tolkien was able to reconnect with the TCBS, and they actually met in Chris Wiseman's home, and they had a gas fireplace, and they smoked pipes, and they solved all the world's problems and were able to reconnect. And that would be the last time they would all be together, because all of them were signed up for World War I, and not all of them survived, which we'll talk about in the next episode. But so Tolkien, he gets top marks in 1915. He graduates with a degree in language and literature, and he he enlists as a signal officer in World War One. Okay, and his job as a signal officer, and he enlisted in the Lancashire Fusiliers in 1914. And his job was to maintain communication between command posts. Okay, and they used to do this in a number of ways back then. They did so with flags. They did so with hand signals, whistles, runners, letters. Something called a heliograph, which a heliograph would catch the sunlight, and they would use that to flash Morse code. But a lot of those methods were dated at this point because this was an artillery trench war. And so anytime the enemy would see any of that happening, they would shell that location wherever the flags or the heliograph was flashing. So they used a lot of telegraphic wire. And towards the end of the war, they would learn radio communication with call signs and all of that. That was more secure and covert. You know, it didn't attract all the attention that then would be followed by shelling. So Tolkien, he trains as a signal officer, and during that time, he and Edith are married. They get married at St. Mary's Immaculate Church Cathedral in Warwick. I actually got in trouble in the last episode because I said Warwickshire, and my friend who's from England, he quickly corrected me and said it's not Warwickshire, it's Warwickshire. So I'm trying to say it better. They actually got married in Warwick. So around this time, the soldiers entering the war on the front lines, they were only lasting about 2 weeks. So Tolkien's life expectancy is really, he's not expecting to live through the war. And if he wasn't killed, there was sickness in the trenches. It was just a really bad situation. So in the aftermath of their honeymoon, I think he's trying to wrap up his artistic career because he doesn't believe he's going to survive. And he tries to get, 2 times, he tries to get his poems published in a compendium called The Trumpets of Faerie. Sedgwick and Jackson rejects it twice, and Tolkien feels, unfulfilled. He feels like, he really has all this desire and all this creativity, but it's just not going to happen right now. When he was leaving for France, Tolkien composed a poem called The Lonely Isle, and the last lines of that poem read, "O lonely sparkling isle, farewell." And this probably captures his sentiment, not just leaving home and not just going into a situation that's where the chances of survival are very grim. He's leaving his new wife, and he said that to him felt like a death. He really did feel like he was saying goodbye to his life when he left England. So those are the circumstances under which Tolkien enters World War I. Thank you for joining us on this podcast. Please check out our YouTube channel. You can just search Noteworthy Reading on YouTube. And we look forward to talking more in our next episode about Tolkien's experience in World War I. Thank you.